What's up, journeyers? Welcome to today's Tuesday live training. We are talking emergency funds. Are they good? Are they bad? Do they prevent emergencies or do they call in more? Let's talk about it. All right, I am stoked for this Tuesday live training about emergency funds because the reality is there's a lot of mixed messaging about emergency funds. So not only are we going to talk about whether it's good or bad to have, we're going to talk about how much you should have, if you should have it, when you should have it, what it should look like for you, how to know if it's good for you, all of the things about emergency funds. So there are two polarizing lines of thought when it comes to emergency funds. One of them is the line of thought that says, oh my gosh, you should always have an emergency fund. It's your rainy day fund. It's definitely going to rain. You should totally have a rainy day fund because you're going to have emergencies. So you must have an emergency fund. And there's like this fear involved, right? There's the complete opposite train of thought on emergency funds, which is you don't need an emergency fund. What a waste. You're just letting money sit there. It's not being invested. It's a complete waste. You should never have an emergency fund. Not to mention, if you have an emergency fund, you're just asking for emergencies. You are literally, law of attraction, calling in emergencies if you have an emergency fund. As expected, for any of you who have been in my world for any length of time, you can believe that I fall somewhere in the middle. I fall somewhere in the middle because the truth is, law of attraction has nothing to do with whether or not you have a bank account open. It has nothing to do with whether or not you happen to have some money sitting in savings somewhere. It also has nothing to do with whether you call it an emergency fund or call it something else. That is not the basis of law of attraction. Law of attraction has to do with your mindset. It has to do with what you're thinking about. It has to do with what you're focusing on, okay? If you are constantly worried there may be an emergency, stressed about an emergency, freaked out about a possible emergency, you're going to not only see the emergencies, but you're going to see things that aren't emergencies as emergencies because that is all you're focused on. Something's going to come up that when you look at like the math, you really are fine. But because you are so hyper focused on emergency, you're going to see that thing come up and you're going to go, ah, right? This happened to me. I wouldn't say I was hyper focused on emergencies, but it stressed me out. We had something happen, and I was like, oh, the world is ending. It wasn't even that bad. It was the brakes went out on our van, like the day and a half before we were supposed to leave to drive across the country. And literally, my husband was like, what's the big deal? Well, it's $650. And he was like, and? We got money, don't we? In our emergency fund? And I was like, oh, yeah, we do. Okay. Suddenly, emotionally, this emergency was no longer an emergency. It was now just something that happened. I was going to say it was an inconvenience, and it was because we had to take the van in, right? But financially, move money, savings, checking, done. Covered. No impact on our budget whatsoever, right? So the thought that having an emergency fund means you call in more emergencies is really flawed. It's really flawed because it assumes that that means you're entirely focused on emergencies. So how do we actually find that balance? So looking at the other side of things, of this like freaked out fear versus your money needs to be invested. If something happens and you need cash, you don't need your money to be in some investment account somewhere because it will be days before you can get your money, right? The other thought is, well, just put your money in investments instead of in a savings account, and then you can use a credit card for emergencies. But how would you like to have an emergency financially and then be charged 11% interest on your emergency? That creates a deeper emergency, doesn't it? If something happens that financially you can't afford, and then you're charged a penalty for having to pay for it, doesn't that make it worse? Right? So where do we find the balance? I'm going to tell you where my heart is at, where my head is at, and what I think is a good way to think about your emergency fund. So the first thing is our emergency fund is no longer called an emergency fund. We actually call it our freedom fund. Our freedom fund gives us the freedom to take care of things that pop up. It gives me the freedom to not work if I don't want to work. It gives us the freedom to take care of things around the house that need to be taken care of. It gives us the freedom to deal with anything that comes up financially. It gives us the freedom to not stress and not be worried about a potential job loss. It gives us the freedom to not worry about my daughter being out of daycare for 4.5 weeks when I still have to pay for daycare and can't work. Okay, do you see that? We call it our freedom fund because that's what it does. It gives us freedom financially to not have to stress about things that come up, because things will come up and they are not all emergencies. Sometimes they're just annoyances, right? Things will come up. So we call it our freedom fund, and it is for things that are unexpected, unavoidable, and urgent. Urgent, unexpected, and unavoidable. That is what it's for. And that way we can take care of it without stressing. So it's good to have some money in savings for that. Now, let's address the math issue here, because this is the part where people say, well, why would you put it in an account that gets you like 0.01% interest maybe? Why wouldn't you put it in investments and then deal with it later? Okay, it's math. That's all they're looking at is math. But if you have an emergency and you don't have access to your money because it's in an investment, if something happens, can't get to your money because it's going to be days, 5 to 7 days before you can get to your money, and you don't want to use a credit card, or maybe you don't even have a credit card because then you're going to be penalized for that purchase, having cash accessible to you is important, right? Not only that, but some emergencies, some things that come up do need to be paid for in cash and not with credit. And so there you go. Having access to it, having quick access to it is super important. So how can we find a good balance? Well, one way to find a good balance is to house your emergency fund in a high yield savings account. So it's in something like a money market account or a high yield account so that it's getting more interest than a standard savings account, but it is readily available, readily accessible, and easy to get to if something comes up and you need to get to it, right? There's a balance there. This is what we do. And then we can get to it if we need it. So then the question comes, how do I know how much I should have? And how do I know if my mindset is all jacked up when it comes to my emergency fund? So if you are watching, I do want to hear your story. Do you have an emergency fund? How much do you have in your emergency fund? Do you have 1 month's income, 2 months of expenses? What do you have in your emergency fund? Do you have just a random number? You don't have to tell me the actual amount if you don't want to. But how much do you have in your emergency fund, and what does that look like for you? What does that feel like for you? And so how do you know if you have enough? So this is where you have to go find that line between panic thinking, right? Law of attraction, panic thinking, worst case scenario, oh my God, right? You don't need to go to that, right? Because most people's worst case scenarios is far beyond the purview of what they would ever put into an emergency fund, right? Most people's worst case scenario is, hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt, right? So in the States. So don't go worst case scenario. Start thinking logically and rationally. Logically and rationally. Is there a possibility of a job loss? So for example, in our situation, my husband is in the military. The possibility of income loss on his side is slim to none. It would likely involve some sort of catastrophic injury on his part, and even then we would end up with a check from the VA, right, for disability and other things, right? So the likelihood of job loss and income loss from my husband is slim to none at this point, right? Which we are very grateful for. right? So that's something to take into consideration. If you're in a situation where the likelihood of job loss is like, oh, man, I could lose my income at any time, I could lose my job at any time, you know, maybe I should consider that with how much money I want to have in my freedom fund so I don't have to freak the F out if that happens, right? It's about giving you that freedom, giving you that peace, giving you that peace of mind to know that you have that cushion, right? And then you can also think about, this is something we factor in, is our deductibles, so catastrophic deductibles for your insurance. So our home, we have $2,000 deductibles on the home and $2,000 deductible for like fire and things like that, and then a $2,000 deductible for other covered perils, which would be like hail, trees falling on the house, that kind of stuff. And so 2,000. If the worst happens to our house, the most of deductibles we would have to pay is $4,000. So we factor that in to make sure we have that if worst case scenario, right? And again, you don't always have to go to worst case scenario, but for us, job loss is not it. Job loss is not it. We also have TRICARE, medical expenses, not it, right? But if we had a tornado come through and we lost our home, that would probably be our worst case scenario, right? And so, but we have insurance, so we just think deductibles. We need to have deductibles. We need to have some money to put us into a hotel. That's it. We're not going to lose income, right? We're still going to have the income that we need. We just need to be able to cover the immediate expenses for that. You can also think, especially if job loss is one of your possibilities, think about how much you need to run your household per month. And usually the recommendation is 3 to 6 months of expenses, not of income, but of expenses. So if it requires to run your household is housing, so rent or mortgage payment, utilities, transportation, which is fuel and your car payment, so you can still get to and from work, food, and possibly clothing. Okay, that's it. Your fun money, your entertainment money, your literally anything that's a want, right, or expendable doesn't really count in terms of your monthly expenses, right? This is what does it require to run your household, right? To not get the lights shut off, to put food on the table. And then take that, multiply it by 3, possibly 6 if you have a little bit more question marks around your income. And then think about that plus your deductibles. There is no magic number. There is no magic number for what needs to be in your freedom fund. I will say, however, once you start pushing up over the like 6 months of expenses mark, you're starting to lean into that fear-based decision making. And if you want a whole training on how to take fear out of your decisions, go to events in the group and go back and look at it. But once you start popping up over a 6-month emergency fund, you're really leaning into fear-based decision making. Because at that point, if you were to lose your income entirely, it typically will not be more than 6 months before you get another job, right? Even if it's delivering pizzas, okay? And so once you start pushing up past that, I know people are like, well, I've got, $20,000 in my emergency fund, which is about 4 months of expenses, but I really would rather have 100,000 in there. I'm like, why? Well, that, replace our annual income and just in case. And no, there is a point at which you start to reach fear-based decision making. Once you hit that, then you're leaning into the law of attraction issues and you're going to start calling in Murphy. So we say Murphy's coming when you start leaning into the fear-based decision making. So let it be objective, let it be rational, where you say, okay, I'd like to have a couple of months of expenses and our major deductibles if necessary. Our deductibles for our vehicle is $1,000 each. So if both of our vehicles were destroyed, right? So our major deductibles and maybe your medical out-of-pocket max, right? Those are things to think about, right? If the catastrophic happens and you have health insurance, you have an annual out-of-pocket max. Everyone does. So what's that number? So these are things you can look at. This might get to a point where you go, oh my gosh, my deductibles plus my out-of-pocket max plus 3 months of expenses. Oh my gosh, that's $12,000. There's no way I can put, that's fine. It is called a freedom fund for a reason, because the goal of this fund is to give you the freedom to take some pressure off, the freedom to make good decisions and not fear-based decisions, the freedom to be able to take care of things that need to be taken care of taken care of without stressing. I have a friend who literally just this weekend had a plumbing emergency at his house, like literally water, pipes, everything was crazy. And he had an emergency fund and he was like, oh, okay, it's taken care of, right? Oh, okay. That's why we call it the Freedom Fund, right? Because it gives you the freedom to just take care of what needs to be taken care of. As long as you are functioning within a non-fear-based decision making about your emergency fund. It is okay to say, you know what, I just want to get, if I could just get $1,000 in there so that like if my car breaks down, we can take care of that. Like just one little thing, like if I could just get $1,000 and then I'll work on paying off my debt. Great. Only you know where that needs to be to give you the peace of mind and the freedom for where you are right now. Okay. Then you can set a goal for where you want it to be for the bigger picture and for long term. But there is truth to the idea that if you start making your decisions based on fear, if you start making your decisions based on, oh my God, what if this happens? What if the worst? You're going to start getting a little crazy. And then you're going to start having the actual lost opportunity cost of investing more money. So if you have, 10 months of expenses in there, well, really, you could pull out 4 to 6 months worth of expenses and put it in investments, pay it towards your house, pay down some debt, right? There are things you could do at that point. And so really look at what level are you at? If you are at 0, I would encourage you, whatever your financial process is right now, to stop paying down debt, stop paying extra towards things, stop paying extra towards credit cards, stop paying extra towards houses, stop paying extra towards things for as long as it takes to get you $1,000 to $2,000 into a savings account. Again, a high yield savings account, a money market account is fine because that gives you a little bit of interest on it, but you want it to be somewhere you have access to. I highly recommend you do that. Why? Freedom. Freedom and peace of mind. The freedom to say, if that happens, we're going to be okay. No stress. Don't have to make decisions based on fear because there's a lot less fear. When you have some money sitting in an account that you know you could access if something crazy happened, it allows you to move forward with the rest of your decision making with a lot less fear. And when you make decisions out of fear, you tend to make the wrong decision. And even if it's the right one, you tend to still have all the crazy emotions about it, right? Again, I did a training on this a while back. So go into events and scroll down until you see removing fear because it's super good. It's really good. So, this is where I stand on emergency funds. Call it whatever you want. Call it your chunk change fund. Call it your cash stash fund. Call it your freedom fund. I don't care what you call it. It has nothing to do with the name of it, has nothing to do with the fact that you have it. It has everything to do with how you feel about the money that you have in savings. It has everything to do with the thought processes that you're using to make those decisions. Because when you're using fear, when you're using the sky is falling, that is when you start having the issues of calling in more emergencies. I tend to find that having an emergency fund, whatever you call it, tends to turn emergencies into inconveniences. Literally, it's like, oh, that thing happened. It's going to be $1,500. That sucks. All right, here's $1,500. Done. Done. It's a little bit inconvenient because for the next month or 2 or 3, I'm going to have to replenish that $1,500 into my emergency fund. But in the moment, the fact that that thing happened doesn't mean that, oh my God, how am I going to feed my kids? Oh my God, how am I going to keep the lights on? Oh my God, how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to pay my mortgage? Isn't it worse? Isn't it more fearful? Isn't it more terrifying? Isn't it less freeing and less peaceful to be in a position where if something happened, it could potentially mean that you can't keep the lights on? Isn't that worse than the theoretical law of attraction by just having an emergency fund? Isn't that fear a lot heavier? Doesn't that make you make different decisions? Doesn't that fear make you make bad decisions? More impulsive decisions? If you can create this freedom fund, this hope fund, this cash stash, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. If you have that, 3 to 6 months of expenses, maybe 3 months plus a couple deductibles, depending on what you've got, right? Feel into it. What feels good? What seems right for you? Have that, and then be able to go, huh, okay, shit happened. And suddenly these things that happen that would have literally rocked your world are now just little bumps in the road. So I'm in a position where I fall somewhere in the middle because I don't think that you need to create an emergency fund out of fear. I don't think that you need to create an emergency fund because the world is going to end and you're going to be screwed and the sky is going to fall, right? I don't think that that's why. Stuff will happen. And that's just life, right? I actually have found that less stuff happened once I had the Freedom Fund in place, right? Less things happened because I set up that I was going to be prepared for it, right? I don't think that that fear is the reason why you need to have it. The reason why you need to have it is because it removes fear. It gives you freedom. It gives you peace of mind. It gives you the ability to be like, okay, fine. All right, here's your deductible. All right, here's this thing. All right, take care of it. All right, fix the car. It gives you freedom to have peace about what's going on with your money. And it gives you freedom to be able to make decisions not from a place of fear, but from a place of confidence and from a place of peace, right? I also think that when you have to go into debt because of an emergency, it only makes it worse. It only makes it feel worse. It only makes it more scary. It only makes it more frustrating, right? And so the idea that you should just put emergencies on a credit card and invest all of your cash, it really leaves you open to other things going wrong too, right? So there's nothing worse when something bad happens than going into debt and then having to stress out and fear and worry about that debt 6 months later. You're still paying off this thing, right? So I fall in the middle. It's not about fear. It's about removing fear. It's about freedom. It's about peace. And also put it somewhere where you get a little bit of interest on it, right? Put it somewhere where you're going to get a little bit of cash back for it. Put it somewhere that you can still have access to it, but get a little bit of a return. There are investment advisors that you can talk to about what those options are. There are some other investment options where you can put it, where you could have access to it a little bit faster. But again, you're looking at capital gains, taxes. There's a lot of things that you look at if you put money into an investment account and then try to pull that out to take care of something that comes up versus just having it in a high yield savings account. Okay. Let me know if you have questions. I know Angela said she has no emergency fund yet, but she's getting there. Immediate goal is $2,000. Unexpected fund, $2,000 emergency, unexpected fund, $1,000 like a slush fund, and 3 months of full bills. So you probably will end up with about 4 or 5 months worth of full bills expenses in terms of the number inside of your emergency fund, which is perfect, It puts you at a great position to make sure that you have that. Now, you don't have to have 3 months of expenses plus this deductible, plus this deductible, plus this deductible. Just make sure that whatever deductibles you have would also be covered in what you've got, because that's the likelihood of everything happening at once is slim. Okay. Especially if your mind and your heart is just at peace and feeling freedom about it. It's good stuff. All right. I hope that was helpful. I was having this conversation with someone on Sunday about the idea of where do we put our emergency fund and do we have an emergency fund and what does that really look like? Not everybody can get a credit card anyway, so having an emergency fund takes some of the fear out of your decision making. It allows you to be at more peace with things, and also allows you the freedom to be able to trust yourself with your money and trust your money decisions and move forward comfortably and confidently. Okay. All right. I love you guys. Have a fan-freaking-tastic Tuesday. As always, trust yourselves and enjoy the journey.